the mic's on, that's good. I was worried about that. Okay, well, hello everyone. I can't actually see any of you, but I can see the lights, so that's all that kind of really counts. Alright, so, let's go back to 1946. The world is divided by war, ideology, and economic depression. Among all this, in a small hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, world leaders meet for the first time and imagine an end to this terror. It was here that GDP, gross domestic product, a metric for new economic development, was first conceptualized. And it's here on this stage today, in the 21st century, that I'm saying enough is enough. We have to have an end to economic growth. So why am I here, you may be thinking? Yep, I'm a geography student, I'm definitely not an economist. And it all comes down to this Indigo Prize. In 2017, I entered the inaugural Indigo Prize, which is an economics prize designed to create a new metric for the 21st century economy. They wanted entrants to design something that not only quantified social and economic factors, but also quantified the digital and creative and innovative forces that will carry us through to the 21st century. I designed the Global Integration and Individual Potential Index, which I'll come back to later. But just to show you how important it was, we had a Wikipedia page. And you know you've made it when you get cited on Wikipedia. So back to GDP. What is it? Well, GDP is the total valuation of goods and services in an economy. But given that this is the metric that quantifies everything that we understand about the economy and everything that we understand about economic growth and dictates the way that we live our lives, what do these terms even mean? Well, I'm going to break them down for you. Goods and services. In the 21st century economy, what we understand as goods and services is more interchangeable now than ever. Goods and services are moving across borders at unprecedented paces. And goods, for example, how do we know that a counterfeit iPhone that is made in China, that is quantified within China's GDP, doesn't quantify the innovation that goes into it in Silicon Valley? And services, what about the care services that are given? What about childcare? What about care of elderly people in an aging population? These are all things that we have to start thinking about and that GDP doesn't even touch. And what about an economy? What does that even mean? As a geography student who really likes places and spaces, we think about new places that economies can reside in. That means not just the national economy. That could mean the regional or the local economy. And what about the global economy? An economy where things are moving between other countries at an unprecedented rate. Why aren't we thinking about those? And why doesn't GDP quantify them? So I put metrics in this slide because they're pretty damn important. They dictate not only how we live our lives, but also the priorities that politicians and governments place on our lives. So government policy is completely dictated by economic growth, for example. Why don't we have other objectives? And why is this the number one thing that economies look at? Metrics are therefore inherently political. If we decide that by putting GDP at the forefront of our economic policy, then we also implicitly put growth at the forefront of economic policy. And growth simply isn't working. It's not working for us now, and it's not working post-2008 after the financial crisis. Growth isn't enough of an objective for us anymore. There are some things that need to be considered that simply aren't. GDP fails to quantify certain things, and this demonstrates that GDP is only measuring the formal economy. So what does that actually mean? I put this up because the economy is currently circulating informal and formal goods and services more than it ever has. There are things that are moving from the informal economy into the formal, which means they become quantified by GDP, and things that are moving out of the formal into the informal sector. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, the informal is traditionally anything that hasn't been measured by GDP before. It's things that constitute perhaps like the black economy. It exchanges cash, things that aren't actually quantified and written down within our national accounts. Therefore, there are things with an output that simply aren't quantified. And in the 21st century economy, with major gig economy structures like this, there are spaces that are becoming formalized that have previously been informal. What about Uber? It commodifies the car space. Airbnb commodifies the home. TaskRabbit commodifies a person and the ability that they have to lend themselves out to other people. And WeWork commodifies workspaces. So there are things that are moving quite severely from the informal to the formal sector, and vice versa. Working is becoming more and more flexible, with things like zero-hour contracts established and Uber drivers becoming self-employed. There are things that aren't quite being captured within formal economic employment. Here are some ideas, for example. So self-employed working at home, women, social media. Environment, community, and security. These are all ideas that don't quite come under GDP, but that are really important to an individual. So just to think about social media, just as a show of hands, if we were to imagine that the average GDP of an American citizen is $31,000, do you think that the American would value their emails at over $1,000? Could you raise your hand if you think so? No. Okay. Any more than $2,000? Any more than $3,000? Okay, well in actual fact, American citizens value their emails at just over $8,000. And even worse, they value their search engines at $17,000. So if you add those two together, that constitutes quite a significant part of their average GDP. And yet this isn't being quantified within GDP, which doesn't make much sense when there are so many things that we value that aren't being formalized. This is a diagram that indicates the number of other indicators that are out there. So GDP obviously was founded in 1946, and we've had a number of other indicators since, but none of these quite do the job. We have HDI, which is a composite of health and education. We have the Happy Planet Index, General Economics, and even the OECD's life expectancy. But the GIPE, which is my indicator, is the last one. And the difference between it and other indicators is that it's a non-comparative measure. For the first time, I have said that we shouldn't be comparing economies. It's actually not very productive. Why are we comparing national economies when it's not national economies that are the true value of economic activity in the world at the moment? So this is my indicator, the Global Integration and Individual Potential Index, or the GIPE for short. So what does it even mean? So there are four components. There is the global integration and the individual potential aspects. So with individual potential, I've marked out three key things: perception, opportunity, and ability. These are the three things that dictate how an individual is able to function in a national economy. And then extrapolating the individual into the global, how integrated is an individual into the global economy? And this is global integration. So these are the four aspects of the GIPE. So let's start with individual potential. I've offered three particular examples: perception, opportunity, and ability. And I believe that these three things, when considered in the following 8 factors, is what really dictates how able an individual is to act within an economy. Here are the 8 factors. Economy. Geography. That includes human and physical geography. So physical geography such as a country's resources, or the human geography of their population, or just understanding their culture better. Equality, how equally and how prosperous are all citizens within an economy. That includes minorities, women, anyone who isn't constituted within the formal economy. Government. Is the government free, and is it democratic? And are individuals able to have an impact on how the government runs? Freedoms. This entails social freedoms, gender freedoms, the freedoms to act and express in the way you want to. Health. Human capital. And lastly, the environment. And then I put all these together on what I like to call engine economics. So these three factors are constituted within a composite bar chart of sorts on the right-hand side. So I've given an example economy of all these different factors put together. And this particular scenario, just to sort of play it out, this particular country doesn't do very well on freedoms or geographical because it's not sort of reaching its full potential. But the difference between freedoms and geographical is that it does particularly poorly in perception of freedoms, but does quite well in ability. So you can sort of see how each of these things measured out differently. And secondly, global integration. So this is more about my beliefs in how the economy should function. In a 21st century economy, where all these movements are happening so rapidly and so succinctly, why aren't we prioritizing data and information exchange and trying to share these ideas and innovative practices into sort of one big pool? Why are we comparing economies and still playing them off against one another in a very competitive setting? So this goes by concept, engine economics. And so this takes global integration and turns it into one big engine. And the engine constitutes the 8 factors that global integration is part of. And then, if you put those two together, then you end up getting an engine. So you get the propellers, which are constituted of opportunity, perception, and ability of individuals. And then you have the engine size itself. Now, the propellers should match, roughly speaking, the size of the engine, because if a propeller is cut short, then that means that a country probably shouldn't globally develop or try and integrate itself globally until it's ready to do so. So the two of them should roughly match in size, and the larger the engine is, the more globally integrated they are. So overall, and roughly speaking, the one benefit of GDP is there is one regulated statistic, and one statistic that is very easy to understand. If GDP is rising, then the economy is growing, and if GDP is falling, then we're in a bit of trouble. But what this does is that it puts all of my factors, which is very complicated to sort of conceptualize normally, unlike GDP, which is just one statistic, and it puts them into one graph that is quite easy to understand. Essentially, if the propellers don't match the size of the engine, then the country shouldn't be globally integrating as much as it is. And the larger the engine, the more the potential it has, the larger potential it has to take off. And this is a metaphor that I've used in terms of a plane just sort of taking off the ground into new realms of economic growth. So that is my talk, and that is my indicator. And lastly, I just want to end on a note of urgency. Our metrics dictate how we function. They dictate our lives, they dictate policy, and they dictate how governments are run and how they conceptualize the way that we live our lives. And if we don't have the right metrics, and if we don't have the right priorities, then our economy moving forward is going to be quite jilted. So please, adopt the GIPE and abolish GDP. Thank you very much.